All right, let's talk about the end of the world. For well over a century, Christians have been wrestling with two really powerful and really different stories about how it all goes down. Today, we're going to unpack both of them.
So, let me ask you a question. When you scroll through the news on your phone, when you look at the world around you, what kind of story do you see playing out? Is it a story of things just spiraling into chaos? Or is it maybe one of quiet, sometimes hidden, but steady progress? Do you get the sense that the world is in this constant downward slide, basically heading for a total crash that's going to need some kind of dramatic last-second rescue? Or do you see a world that, for all its massive problems, is actually, slowly but surely, being won for God's kingdom? Now, these aren't just, good days and bad days. These are two totally different ways of reading the Bible and making sense of history itself.
And for the better part of 2 centuries, these two competing stories have shaped how millions of people think, how they vote, and how they live their lives. So we're going to break them both down. We'll look at where they came from, what they teach, and why it matters.
Okay, so let's start with the one you've almost definitely heard about. You've seen it in movies, you've read it in novels, maybe heard it from the pulpit. It's the dominant story in so much of modern Christianity, the Great Escape.
Now, the fancy theological name for this system is dispensationalism. And here's the core idea, the thing you have to get to understand the whole system. It teaches that God has two completely separate peoples with two completely separate plans. There's a plan for national Israel, and then there's a totally different plan for the church. That distinction right there is the key that unlocks everything else.
And that key unlocks a very specific, step-by-step timeline. It goes like this. First, you have the rapture, where the church just vanishes from the planet in an instant. That event kicks off the tribulation, a 7-year global nightmare orchestrated by the Antichrist. After those 7 years, Christ returns, but this time visibly, publicly, with the church. That's the second coming. And that sets up a literal 1,000-year reign on earth run out of Jerusalem. See? It's a very clear, sequential plot.
So you gotta ask, why did this become so popular? Well, for a few reasons. One, it's pretty simple to follow, and it's incredibly cinematic. It's tailor-made for blockbuster movies. It also really takes the evil we see in the headlines seriously, so it resonates with our anxieties. Plus, it creates this intense sense of urgency, that Jesus could come back literally at any second. And crucially, it gives the modern state of Israel a central, starring role in Bible prophecy.
But the super detailed roadmap of the future, where did it come from? It didn't just appear out of thin air. It actually has a specific architect, one guy who put this entire framework together back in the 19th century. And his name was John Nelson Darby. He was an Anglo-Irish theologian, and back in the 1830s, he was the very first person to really systematize all these different pieces: the secret rapture, the hard line between Israel and the church, the idea of a postponed kingdom, and put them into one single coherent system.
So how did Darby's niche theory become this global phenomenon? Well, you can kind of track it in 4 major leaps. It all started with a personal crisis for Darby back in 1827. Then, almost a century later, in 1909, the super popular Scofield Reference Bible put Darby's entire system right there in the study notes. So millions of people were basically reading his theory right alongside the biblical text. Fast forward to 1970, Hal Lindsey writes The Late Great Planet Earth, which brilliantly connects Darby's timeline with Cold War fears, and it becomes a monster bestseller. And then, of course, in 1995, the Left Behind series turned the whole thing into a pop culture juggernaut.
And this quote from Darby himself really gets to the heart of what was driving him. He looked around at all the chaos and what he saw as the failure of the institutional church in 19th century Europe, and he basically concluded that history was a lost cause. The only real hope wasn't in fixing the world, but in escaping it. But that is not the only story on the table, not by a long shot. There's another much older view that's been making a major comeback, and this is the story of a long, slow, but certain victory. This view is called post-millennialism, and it flips the script. It says Christ's kingdom isn't just some future 1,000-year event, it's a present reality that is growing and expanding in the world right now through the gospel. So in this story, history isn't a story of decline, it's the stage where the gospel progressively wins, leading to this great age of faith and Christian influence before Jesus comes back. Now, to really get this view, you have to understand an interpretive tool that often goes with it, called
partial preterism. It's a bit of a mouthful, but the idea is simple. It argues that a lot of those scary end times prophecies in the Bible weren't actually about our distant future. They were about events that were about to happen to the people who first heard them. Specifically, things like the Great Tribulation are identified with the absolute horror of the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And that's huge because if many of the big judgment prophecies have already happened, it clears the historical stage for that optimistic, kingdom-building work of post-millennialism to take place.
So instead of looking for newspaper headlines to match prophecies, this view points you back to the parables Jesus told. Remember? He said the kingdom is like a tiny little mustard seed that grows into this massive tree. It's like leaven or yeast that quietly and invisibly works its way through the entire batch of dough. It's like a stone that smashes all the earthly kingdoms and then grows into a mountain that fills the whole earth. The theme is always the same. Small start, slow and patient, but unstoppable growth.
Okay, so we've got two radically different ways of seeing the future. Let's put them head to head and look at the core issues where they really disagree.
Let's take the phrase, the last days. When you hear that, what comes to mind? Well, the dispensational view says it's talking about right now, our current era, the final stretch before the rapture. But the partial preterist view says, hang on, for the New Testament writers, the last days referred to the end of their age, the final days of the Old Covenant system, which came to a crashing, fiery end with the destruction of the temple in AD 70.
And what about the rapture itself, that famous passage in 1 Thessalonians? The Great Escape view sees believers being whisked away from the earth in secret. The Long Victory view points out something fascinating about the Greek word used there for meeting the Lord in the air. That word was commonly used when a delegation from a city would go out to meet a visiting king, not to run away, but to welcome him and escort him back into their city in a grand procession. So it's not an escape from the world, but a public welcome to the world for its returning king.
But maybe the most crucial difference, the one that everything else hinges on, is the role of Israel. For dispensationalism, God still has a separate, unfinished prophetic plan just for national Israel. The other view, the Reformed or post-millennial view, argues that the Old Testament promises find their ultimate yes in the Messiah Jesus and in his church, which is this new, multinational body made up of both Jews and Gentiles together, what the Bible calls the one new man.
Look, these aren't just abstract ideas for theologians to debate. They have massive, real-world consequences for how you view your life, your work, your mission, the very meaning of history itself.
At the end of the day, it really boils down to this fundamental question. Does your view of the future tell you that this world is basically a sinking ship, and our main job is just to get as many people into the lifeboats as we can before the whole thing goes under? Or does it tell you that you are a worker on a construction site, part of building a lasting, durable kingdom that's meant to grow and influence the world for generations?
So let's just put it all on one table. The Great Escape. It sees history's path as decline, the church's role as survival until rescue, the key event as the future rapture, and its ultimate hope as an imminent escape. The Long Victory. It sees history's path as progress, the church's role as conquest through the gospel, the key event as Christ's past ascension to his throne, and its ultimate hope as the gradual transformation of the world.
And all of this leaves us with one final question to think about. Is history a coded script that we're supposed to be frantically trying to decode, matching newspaper headlines to Bible verses? Or is it the construction site of a kingdom that we have been called to build? Your answer to that question changes everything.